that says loving Jesus means keeping His commandments. It doesn't. It says the opposite almost. If you love me, that's one thing. It will produce another thing. Obedience. But if you turn obedience into that, where will that come from? You become a legalist. That's what you do. Christian hedonism is meant to keep people from becoming legalists by defining the stuff we do as what God expects of us first. And He doesn't. He expects us to be happy first. In Him, totally. So that if we lose everything, we've got everything. So that's my first argument. That's John 14, verse 15. Won't let obedience be equated with love of God or Jesus. Obedience flows from love. It isn't what love is. Number two, another piece of evidence. There is a second commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And it is emphatically not the first commandment. It is like it, then you've got to think how, but it isn't it. So if you try to translate love of God, just translate it, equate it, make them identical, loving God with loving people, you lose loving people. Because you can't love people if this thing doesn't come first. What are you going to give them? What treasure? What treasure that your heart hasn't first become satisfied by? How are you going to go to anybody and offer them anything but yourself and their ego? Oh, how many people call that love? It isn't. What's love is when you give these people, you give that grandmama God, she's got to have God. Not me. We've got one thing to give. We've got one treasure, God, through Christ, paid for by blood. That's love. And if we don't love this, if we don't delight in this, if we're not treasuring this and satisfied with this, we're fake. We're fake as we try to love people. So the fact that there is a first and a second, and the first is loving God and the second is loving people, means they're not the same. And first comes first. Number three argument. I'm giving you arguments here for why I see it this way. Jesus said one time, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me. Now, think about that. Okay, they're worshiping, not worshiping. They're worshiping and they're vain. It's empty. What are they doing? They're doing the stuff. They're going to church. They're reading their Bibles, going to conferences. They're just doing stuff, good stuff. And he says, that's not worship. That's empty. What's missing? This is missing. Because this is it. That's stuff. That's skin. This is wine. If you want your lifting of hands, your singing of songs, your reading of the Bible, your preaching a sermon, your praying a prayer to be worship, it is rooted elsewhere. Namely in treasuring God. That's why it's first. Last argument. Matthew 6:24. Jesus says, I draw this out because listen to the emotional laden language of Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You can't serve God and money. What kind of talk is that? That's explosive emotional talk is what it is. The issue is money versus God. Love and hate. devoted, despising. That's the kind of language that comes out of Jesus' mouth when he's thinking about how we should relate to God. Loving, devotion, alternative, hatred and despising. These are not deeds. These are delights and despisings. So, I conclude, loving God in the Great Commandment means, most essentially, treasuring God, valuing God, cherishing God, admiring God, desiring God, being satisfied in God, resting delightfully in God. And my thesis point of my life is thinking is intended by God to serve that. That's all I do. That's all I do. Except when I'm sinning, which is lots of times. But at least my aim is to just do that. Do it all day. Do it in everything. Make my thinking that comes out of my fingers or my mouth serve treasuring God. It's all. It's all we all should do in various ways. Loving God with the mind means our mind does all it can to awaken and express treasuring God above all things. Now, why does it matter to stress that distinction between loving God and the means to that end, the mind or thinking? Why does that matter? Because if we don't make that distinction, that is, if we equate loving God and thinking rightly about God, and I've heard many people say, this text is a call to think about God. That's what love is. It's not. If we go that direction, we jeopardize the very reality of love. If you say that fire and fuel are the same, you might forget to order the wood. Then the fire goes out. The fire in our affections for God is not the wood of knowledge that the mind puts in the furnace of our heart. And I'm jealous for the fire. And therefore I'm distinguishing it from the wood and from the mental effort to put the wood on the fire. So loving God with all your mind means engaging all your powers of thought to know God as fully as possible in order to treasure Him for all He's worth. Let me close like this. Now, where do we focus our minds? And here's what I have in mind. I use the word focus. You go to these little cameras, little Canon, teeny-weeny camera, and there's a little green box that comes up when you push the button halfway down. That's where it's focused. You can see the rest of it, and you'd be really sad if the picture came out with only the little green dot on the nose, you know. That would. So don't hear me minimize